Thank you again to Telefilm Canada for presenting this session and the close-up series, and to the Black Screen Office for collaborating with us on this session. Before the rest of our panelists join us to discuss their experiences with creating authentic content, I'd like to welcome Kelly Lynn Ashton, who will be giving a short presentation on the directives from the Being Seen reports, on which she was lead researcher. You can read more about her very impressive career and her full bio on our website, but we're hoping she is a familiar face to many of you as she has been working diligently to share the reports far and wide. Today we'll be digging into the findings a bit more, so for now I will just welcome in Kelly Lynn.
Hi, everybody. That's a great introduction. I have been doing a lot of these panels, and so I wanted to shake things up a little bit by doing a bit more of a deep dive. I can't share, it says. Oh, no, I was just doing it too soon. Sorry. Okay, now I'm going to pull up the presentation. There we go. So I want to do a bit more of a deep dive into the Being Seen reports and the directives. And then we'll go into the roundtable discussion with a terrific group of creators. So as everybody probably knows, the Black Screen Office put together these Being Seen reports with directives for creating authentic and inclusive content. And these were the sponsors, and we're very grateful that they came in and helped us put this rather significant project together with groundbreaking research. So for this presentation, we're going to talk about the whole point of what we did, what we created, which is to look at the question of authenticity in content. What is authentic representation? And look at a couple of the key issues that we talked about in the research and in the consultations. And one of the biggest conversations was about who gets to tell the story, who has the right to tell the story. And if they are telling that story, particularly from outside a community, what is the work that they have to do to ensure authenticity?
In all of Canada's history until 2020, only 4 TV dramas made by and about Black Canadians had made it to air on a major broadcaster. Canada's screen output has been predominantly white, male, and heterosexual, even though Black people have been part of Canada's population since before Confederation. The system is broken, or more accurately, it was designed to exclude Black creators and Black-focused content from the Canadian screen canon. So in 2021, the Black Screen Office set out to identify the central issues that create barriers for Black screen industry workers and Black audiences. While Black people are uniquely marginalized by Canada's screen industry, the BSO recognized that there are common experiences across all underrepresented groups. Examining and addressing inclusion and authentic representation holistically would be critical for the industry to become truly equitable. The BSO launched 3 research projects: Being Counted, Being Heard, and Being Seen. With the knowledge gained from this research, BSO can work with decision makers on tools and strategies to dismantle the industry's anti-Black practices and improve authentic representation overall. The 3 research projects look at the issues from different angles. Being Counted looks at audiences, specifically Black, Indigenous, and people of color audiences, whose preferences are usually hidden within general population data in traditional audience surveys. This basically makes them invisible to screen content decision makers. Through Being Counted, these decision makers gain insight into who they are missing, as well as these viewers' habits and preferences. Being Heard looks inward at the Canadian screen industry. It offers data on the prevalence of Black workers and their experiences. Black industry workers have not been examined in any meaningful way until now, and Being Heard will help identify ways to support their success. Being Seen looks at Canada's screen industry content. Inspired by Imaginative's protocols and pathways, Being Seen explores the perspectives of screen industry professionals and members of the viewing public who are Black, people of color, 2S LGBTQIA+, and people with disabilities. From across the country, more than 400 individuals from these communities participated in Being Seen focus groups and interviews in both English and French. Participants included members of the screen industries as well as the general public. For the Children's Media Report, we talked to children's media creators from the 4 communities, and also parents and children and youth ranging in age from 6 to 17. Knowing that individuals have multiple dimensions, BSO took an intersectional approach to this research, which allowed participants to talk about any aspects of their identity. Letting participants choose allowed them to bring their full selves to these discussions. BSO also divided communities into subcategories whenever possible, such as a blind or deaf focus group within the people with disabilities category. This allowed for deeper exploration of specific communities. Within these Being Seen safe spaces, participants spoke with passion, strength, vulnerability, and at times, tears. They provided valuable insights into how Canada's screen industries can and must change to better reflect them and their needs. Many common themes emerged across the communities, as well as challenges unique to each community group. The result of this research is the Being Seen Core Report, which captures the universal themes shared across all 4 communities. There are also 5 companion reports, 1 in each community, and a Children's Media Report. Each report offers anecdotal insights on representation, as well as clear directives for industry leaders on how to create and commission more authentic and inclusive content. The data and perspectives that Being Counted, Being Heard, and Being Seen reveal establish an evidence-based foundation for change. This BSO research can and should support industry leaders to create and approve content that authentically represents the full diversity of Canada's communities. We also expect them to prompt more discussion and action on the structural changes that are needed to increase representation on set, on screen, and in industry boardrooms.
That's the background. The other thing that we want to talk about is, in terms of why we did this, is the numbers, the data. And that's, the numbers tell a story about who we are as a Canadian population and what we're not seeing. So based on 2016 stats, and shortly we're going to get updated stats, but 1 in 6 people in Canada are people of color. 4% of Canada's population identifies as LGBTQ+, and that's probably underreported. 22% of Canadians live with a disability, and 1.2 million people in Canada identify as Black. So that's a lot of people in Canada from underrepresented identities who do feel every day that they're not being represented either at all or authentically. So what does that mean, authenticity? It's not representation. And that is something that I want to emphasize. A lot of the studies that are out there right now are what I call counting faces. Are people there? It's the first step. It's an important step, but we need to go beyond that. And that's what Being Seen was about. When we see representation, is it authentic? But for some communities, they're not even there yet. So for those who are looking at authenticity, it's about what, you can't actually see all of that quote, but it's the checkbox approach to diversity really negates the fact that so many of us have intersecting identities. We've all come from different backgrounds. What happens in writing rooms in the dominant media is that they decide on a more diverse approach, and it's let's check the boxes. So it's superficial representation rather than going into the complexity of identity. and this is, I'd like everybody in the audience to think, what is authenticity for them? What does it mean? And feel free to share in the chat or questions in the Q&A. But that was a lot of the conversation was about what would make it authentic representation for the participants. And the first thing is authentic storytelling. And that came down to a complexity of characters and stories, a complexity of identity, and a complexity of communities. So and then back up a bit. When we talk about transgender and non-binary communities and people with disability communities, they're two of the largest groups who felt that they're not even being seen. They're not there yet to be able to even complain about the lack of inauthentic storytelling. There have been some, and they're not happy with them. So for example, people with disability communities, it's the major complaint was the representation was white guys, which has a very negative impact on people's lives. Because, for example, women of color, people of color aren't getting diagnosed for autism or neurodiversity because with the lack of representation means that the society doesn't think it's even possible. So there are real world impacts to not having any representation. But then, so to get back to the main theme of storytelling. So what they want, they often refer to it as lazy screenwriting, but it's not just the screenwriters, it's also the producers and the commissioners, because what they are asking for is for people to go beyond the surface and to reflect the full complexity of stories, to look at the complexity of intersectionality. And intersectionality is, for example, it's layers of oppression. So if you are a LGBTQ and Black and person with disabilities, you don't want to just see a Black character. You want to see one with multiple identities. Most people have more than one identity as part of their makeup. And that's what the audience is looking for. That's what creators are looking for, is all those layers. And not just what the expectation is. They like to see research so that you actually understand a community, so that you understand how it works. So, for example, some examples of stereotypes is, we all know about Muslims being constantly portrayed as terrorists, rather than, the people next door, your doctor, your lawyer, the model minority, which is, Asians of any kind always being seen as the successful, they're doctors and lawyers, which takes away from the wide range of people that they are. The hypersexualization of Asian women and the desexualization of Asian men, which can have real world impact on people as they navigate society. We had tearful stories from people, talking about the impact of trying to date when the expectation is that they're a hypersexual woman, or that, not being attracted to Asian men, because even if you're Asian, because you're being told that they're not sexy, because that's what the media is saying. So there are so many, and this is one of the things I want to emphasize, is that it's authentic storytelling, authentic characters is not just a nice thing to have, it has real world impact on the audience. So here's one quote. Often people with disabilities feel, I don't see anybody like me or stories that are like mine being told, and therefore I don't dream those things. I think other folks might experience that as well. And that's a reference to the underemployment that is in people with disabilities. And quite often, and they talked about this, that they find it really hard to get hired. And with the lack of representation of not being able to see themselves on screen doing jobs, people don't think they can do jobs that they're perfectly capable of. So I think we've talked a little bit about storylines and characters. So often representation can be as the sidekick, the best friend, the comic relief. So we're asking for, think about centering people. Think about underrepresented people leading the story, but not only because of their identity. So they want to be the lead, the hero in the story, but it's not because they're a Black person or an Asian person. It's just, that's part of their identity. One thing that I find frustrating is the need for a Black character to either be too perfect or too rough around the edges. I'd love to see, like other characters, like just the full breadth of humanity being able to be shown. When fleshed out, it's kind of helps society to be able to see us as we're well-rounded people. So it's not, it's the flaws, the everything, just as they see in other mainstream characters, not just heroes or victims. So with the complexity of communities, that's getting to understand those communities, understanding, for example, that a Black community is not a monolith. Like there are Africans, there are Caribbeans, there are people who've been here since before Confederation. There's this idea that, you know, if you're Asian or South Asian, you speak with an accent. When some of the people from those communities have been here for generations, decades. You know, Chinese built the railway, so those families have been here for a very long time. There's also the regional diversity, which is there are immigration patterns across the country that vary, so that you're going to have a different ethnic mix in Vancouver than say Toronto or Montreal or Halifax. So when you're building a world, think about that. Don't just go for, well, I know my broadcaster needs to see these people. Well, if the story is set in Vancouver, those people are going to be primarily, you know, East Asian and South Asian. But then also dig into it, because one of the stats that I love is from the 2016 census, two of the fastest growing Black populations in Canada are Lethbridge and Moncton, Alberta. Lethbridge, Alberta, and Moncton, New Brunswick. Which that was a surprise to me, and I've never seen any stories about Black communities in those towns, or the fact that that's being driven by African immigration. I think there's some fantastic stories coming out of those facts. So if everyone with disabilities experiences them differently, even if it's the same or similar disability. So representing everyone is a challenge, but to start would be fantastic. So again, people with disabilities are looking for representation, but keep in mind that one person on the autism spectrum only has their unique experience. Another person's experience is going to be unique, very different. It's the same if it's chronic pain or brain injury or blind or deaf. But that's, I think, is an easy thing to understand. That's consistent throughout all the communities. There's this weird expectation from casting and from directors that we're all interchangeable East Asians, like South Koreans and Chinese and Vietnamese, they're all the same. And we kept hearing, well, no. And I want to spend a little bit of time on casting because it came up in the last Academy Talk session with reference to the directives, because we do have directives there. It's not just about storytelling. It's also about getting into thinking about authenticity when you are casting. And that's something that's come up more recently where people are making an effort. but you have to think about it from the beginning. Like, if you have to take stereotypical character descriptions, like review your character descriptions to make sure they're not stereotypical, because then you'll be setting up barriers to who's going to want to audition. Research the specific cultural or ethnic heritage, because, for example, there's many assumptions about what someone looks like from a particular region that are not actually accurate. So Syrians, for example, come in every skin tone and eye color and hair color. We've had shows that have cast someone of a different background because they looked more ethnic, but that's not authentic. And it's the same in many regions, in Latin America and South America, wide range of skin tones. In South Asian countries, wide range of skin tones. So don't make an assumption. It can also inadvertently support shadeism or colorism, which is this favoring of people who are lighter skinned as more acceptable. That is it rears its head in many cultures, and you don't want to be encouraging that, particularly when it undermines authenticity. Ensure your audition process is accessible, especially if what you want to have a wide range of people auditioning. You have to make sure that a wide range of people can get in. Be more open-minded in terms of your outreach, where you're looking. One of the great stories from the research is someone looking for a young Muslim girl for a show, and she went on to her local mosque's chat and said, "Hey, I'm looking for somebody." And the mother of someone of a girl who wanted to be a performer said, "Hey, my daughter wants to be a performer." And that's how they found her. And then who gets to tell a story is something that we get into a lot, and I'm just sort of running out of time. So this is a big issue, so I'm not going to get into it too much because we could be on here for hours. If it's not your community, there are three groups of people. Someone says some people think anybody can do it. There should be no creative limitations. That would be censorship. Or no one from outside a community can do it. So here's the quote about, I definitely don't think that as creatives, we should be limited to the type of stories that we want to tell. But there should be some, as we call it, guideposts, because we want to involve the culture that we're trying to represent in our stories. But some people felt no one from outside a community should be able to tell it because it assures authenticity and gives opportunities. You're not from that community, you shouldn't be speaking for that community. But a large group where it really depends. It depends on what is your motivation. Are you just trying to ride a wave of the trends? Or are you engaged in the community? There's a short list of topics you shouldn't address, but it really, like if it's dealing with trauma and you're not from that community, you should probably not be doing it. They have a right to make whatever stories they want, but it doesn't make sense when we do have limited representation to give voices to our minority stories from people who are the majority, who then might go on to misrepresent and portray us. And we heard that a lot, that if somebody from outside a community tells a story and makes a mess of it, because we have so little shelf life, then there isn't the opportunity for somebody else to come along and tell that story in a more authentic way, because they get dismissed as, we've already had that, we've already seen that. So what does doing the work? I think we're going to leave that for the roundtable to talk a bit about. We go into that in a lot of detail in the directives. For those who aren't sure, they can go to the directives to get some further guidance on what the work is. It's not good enough to hire a consultant. Sometimes a consultant can work, but it depends on how you involve them. So as we said, we've got the companion reports, and they go into more detail on the stereotypes that people don't want to see, the storylines that they do want to see more of. So I encourage you to look at those. And then the whole reason we're doing this, the story you tell yourself today becomes the reality you live tomorrow. Stories are important. So I'm running out of time and I want to get to the table. So we're going to now, I'm going to, end the show. And great.
While you're taking care of that, I'm just going to pop back in and say thank you for that presentation. I'm sure that it has sparked lots of thought. So we want to remind our audience to put some Q&A, some questions we'll ask for answers in the Q&A. And now I will bring on our panel for that discussion. So first, we'd like to welcome Anthony Farrell. Anthony has served as showrunner on shows such as Overlord and the Underwoods, the upcoming second season of CBC's Run the Burbs, and the BAFTA-winning series Secret Life of Boys. He's also written for The Office, Little Mosque on the Prairie, and more. Next is Christopher Yip, a Chinese-Canadian writer and director based in Toronto, who examines love, family, and sexuality through a distinct diasporic lens. His series Streams Flow from a River will air in early 2023 and is developing his short film Fish Boy into his feature film debut. Next, we have Hoda Elatawi, an executive producer who has been creating award-winning content in Canada and internationally for almost 3 decades. Her new film, So You Want to Be a Muslim, explores identity, religion, and intersectionality in a feature-length doc for CBC and the Documentary Channel, and she is currently developing a number of scripted, children's, and animated series. And finally is JP Larocque, a television writer and producer who has worked on all of your favorites from Sort of and Jan to Coroner and Digstown and more. A proud member of the 2S LGBTQ+ and BIPOC communities, JP is committed to diversity and inclusion in all of their work. So thank you all for joining us, and I'll pass it back over to Kelly Lynn so you guys can chat.
Thank you. So really want this to be roundtable discussion, so everybody just chime in. We've got one question from the audience. Any examples of fleshed out, complex characters who are not only their identity that you love on TV now?
It's always hard because once you see the person, especially as marginalized communities, I'm already kind of attaching a bunch of things to you based on where you're from and what your culture is and those kinds of things. So I tie that into the characters that I see. So I mean, it's hard for me to take that away and just be like, oh, these characters feel like, I don't know, I just think I'm just an old man and it's ingrained in me. But there's a lot of characters I love, but I don't think which ones are specifically like, I don't know, someone else answer.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and a nod to JP and the gang of Sort of, which has become such a darling worldwide. But I have to say, I really related to Saab, the character Saab, who I felt wasn't just about her identity. There were so many elements of that series that I connected with, and particularly with Saab as a character. That was a strong connection for me. So that's my example.
I appreciate you saying that, because I was like, if I say it, it sounds like a plug.
No, but it's true. Like I really mean it.
But I do think that like Bilal and Fab did a really incredible job of wanting to tell a story that was about specific experience, but making it universal. And again, staying away from like trauma narratives that are so often used to define queer characters. And so, yeah, I would definitely say I really appreciated that representation.
Christopher, you're still thinking.
I think it's a tough question. I think, I mean, the key is, the more shows that we have about people who look like us, the more chance, like we discussed in the presentation, the more chance we have to talk about the spectrum, like, different people fulfilling different roles. And so, like, for example, very happy that the Asian community has Kim's Convenience, but not everyone's experience is, blue collar pop and mom shop, South Korean community. So I think that the more shows we do get, the more we'd be able to see, kind of like get over that first fence of we need representation, just representation. And I think it's tough because in the Canadian industry, obviously we have less money than the States. I think in general, people are more risk averse. But it's tough when you hear it's like, you're pitching a show and it's like, I really think that I want to tell a story about an Asian family. And they're like, well, our slate is full. We already have another Asian story. And it's like, man, but that's not my story. Like we got more Asians than just that one family. So I think a roundabout way of answering the question, still wanting more, still work to do.
Well, we've got another question from the audience. Have any of the panelists dealt with backlash on how a character or community were represented in a project they worked on? How did you deal with it?
I can talk a little bit about my time working on the Parker Andersons and Amelia Parker and working with BYU TV. And obviously one of the things that came out during that discussion was that they were, I think for that show, but not for Overlord, they were more about like they wouldn't let us include queer characters. And it's one of those things where we obviously fought and we got queer characters included in a different show, but it was one of those things where it's like I was happy to talk about it because it's one of those things where you think to yourself, this is wild. And then you're just kind of like in a place where you're like, do I do the work to try and figure out inclusivity later on, or do I try and figure it, or do I just quit and move on? So the backlash was, I wouldn't say there was backlash, there was support, there was conversation. I didn't feel like attacked at all. Like I didn't feel like I was like, oh, I got to defend myself. But it was definitely a big conversation that came out once the writers of that room started talking about what happened. So, but it's one of those things where I'm always for the conversation, right? Like I feel like it's important to talk about it, because if you don't talk about it, then everyone just, it can't get better.
I'll just jump in quick and say, I mean, for me, I feel either I don't know about it or very fortunate in that I haven't sensed any backlash, but most of my work has been in the factual sense. So it's like been documentary or even in children's content that we produce. We're often working with real children and children from a variety of different communities. We are embarking on our first scripted series, so that, remains to be said, but, we've got lots of great shining examples in front of us. So we hope not to, make any mistakes and stay, sorry to use this overused word, authentic.
I was going to say, like, Anthony, I remember you touched on in the showrunner boot camp, like what happens when opening up the conversation, what happens when you get notes from, say, execs or the network about specific characters or casting specific characters. And sometimes it comes down to race. It's very like coded and it's very kind of like, oh, we don't like their performance. But I think maybe opening it up to everybody to talk about, I think, how do you learn to choose your battles, pick your battles and figure out which hill to, die on and which one to keep pushing and fighting for. Nice softball for you, like not a difficult question at all, but
no, I mean, we talked about, you did talk about this in the boot camp, because it's one of those things that I think as future showrunners, as current showrunners, you're going to have these conversations all the time, and where a broadcaster is going to use coded language. And I've been told certain things where the vibe was, we already have a Black show, should we cast this character as Black? Like that's stuff that I've dealt with, or even with like recently, just like trying to include a queer character. It's like, well, this person is really cool and they're really funny. Can we cast this person instead? And it's like, well, no, like that person's not queer. We're not, we're trying to have some proper representation. So I think the thing that I always tell people to do is remind the broadcasters that you are trying to authentically represent a community. That community will tweet their displeasure once this comes out. Sometimes broadcasters get afraid of those tweets, and that's something that I think they'll listen to. Like when they hear about potential backlash, then I think they start to kind of go, oh, it's not just, oh, you're right, it's not just you that's fighting, it's you're fighting on behalf of a community. And I think using the community to back you up is a way to kind of like hopefully try and win those arguments. Doesn't always work. And I know we talked about that in the boot camp too. Like you don't always win those battles. And yeah, it's just about trying to figure out what's the best way forward. Like how are you going to be able to stay in the room long enough to help make effective change? So I think it's yeah, it's always tricky.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes, learning how to network whisper and say, I mean, I think yeah.
like I was
Go
just
ahead,
gonna say,
JP.
I'm like, I think like what ties into both of those responses is like, and I think this came out in the report as well, is the need for conversation and an understanding of nuance, right? And I think, with so much of it, there can be this pressure on shows to be representative of an experience in totality, when the reality is that is impossible, right? Like the best one can do is try to bring in as many folks as they can to speak to their lived experiences and have that inform like the fabric of a show. But I do think, when navigating backlash, when navigating controversies, when navigating like a directive from the network, it's about having to sometimes walk through the steps, because I do think there's this understanding of diversity still as kind of like a check mark, as opposed to understanding like, if we're going to do this right, we need to understand that this is going to require a couple different steps. This is going to require, perhaps talking to the casting director and seeing what else we can get. Like it just requires a bit more work and a bit more conversation. So, yeah.
I can jump into just again on the documentary side, and this is going back just a handful of years ago, and it wasn't that long ago, but I was doing a documentary about a subject that, I'm part of that community, and I really wanted to take an approach that had some levity to it. And I remember, and it was a jury, the decisions came out through a jury. So, the fee, I didn't get the funding in that particular instance. And one of the main comments that I got back was that they felt that I should not bring humor or levity to this particular subject. And I was really, just flabbergasted, because I thought, well, I do actually know this community. I know, like, this is from my perspective. And so it was just this interesting sort of other way of looking at that backlash question, a different kind of backlash, I guess, from someone who was from outside of the community telling me how I should treat a particular subject matter. And so it comes down to this idea also of when you have juries that are looking at selecting projects, that the juries are made up of a mix of different and representative communities, so that different perspectives can be brought to the fore when they are looking at projects. So
we've got another question here. Are there examples of meaningful support that executives and producers can offer creatives in these endeavors? So I guess what can a producer do to support?
I mean, recently I worked on a project where, for instance, the subject matter was dealing with the Black trans community. And there was the producer and the producing team, while white, was like, we want to make sure that we do this correctly. We want to make sure that we engage the community that is being portrayed on every level of production. What ended up happening was, in the process of trying to seek out a Black trans director, like Black trans DOP, like going through and speaking to staffing, the unions were kind of coming back and saying, we don't have anybody. So what that required was active engagement with the communities themselves to find non-union talent, and then obtain waivers from the unions to then use those creatives and then bring them on with either producer credits, have them working alongside, whether it's another director or another writer, like bringing in as many people as they could in that capacity. So I think like it is possible. I think it is a thing that does, again, if a producer is really committed to telling a story right, I do think it requires a little bit more legwork, and I think it requires consultations with the community involved, and not an immediate, like the first moment you bump up against something systemic, you bump up against one of the unions saying no, or you bump up against, one of those kind of traditional barriers, you still explore other ways of getting it done, because I do think it is possible to still get it done.
I think that's really great specific advice. Don't let the barriers get in your way. Anybody else, or next question? We've got some really great questions here.
No, I don't have anything else to add to JP's answer. They were.
It was great.
Yeah.
Okay.
What JP said.
Thank you, Anthony.
Okay, another one. How would you suggest navigating stories from characters who come from the same ethnic background as you, but have very different experiences as you?
I mean, I feel this is like what we writers do. Like, I feel like I use the experiences of like my family, my friends. Like, I think I incorporate a lot of different, for me, I think a character feels realer when I'm basing it on something real and grounded and something that I know. So even if it's not my personal experience, usually I'm bringing in something connected to the people I'm related to or people I know. So that's one way I think I do it. If you feel like you don't have anyone in your life like that, go talk to someone who is similar to that character, and you just really just hone in, interview them, talk to them, befriend them, figure out what makes them tick, and then write about them when they're not looking.
But isn't that also the beauty of the variety of stories that we can tell, that even within different groups, there are so many different layers and different kinds of people with different kinds of stories. So I'm always myself just so delighted and surprised by the different experiences that people that come from the communities that I come from that are so different from mine. And that's kind of what makes it so fun to be able to be a storyteller, is to share the experiences that are different from yours, but also find those like nuggets of relatability, because you'll always find those universal themes at the same time, right? So yeah, I think that's a plus, those differences.
For our series, we do kind of like each of the episodes is through the perspective of a family member. So it's like we have a mom and a dad, and we made sure to take, we had an all Asian writers room, which was amazing, of Asian folks from different Asian backgrounds. But we all kind of like compiled our memories of our moms and dads and kind of like wrote them into the scripts. And I think also for like JP was saying, I think it starts at in the prep stage, right? So it's kind of like I can't specifically write for an Asian female experience, so I'll try to invite as many Asian female writers into the writers' room as I can, and we can kind of exchange notes and make sure that the voice is clear and authentic. But I think it's nice when you have the opportunity to do that, like put out the call for like just Asian writers for an Asian story.
I think that answered one of our other questions. How do you balance cultural specificity with also the desire to resonate with audiences on a universal level? I think you all sort of answered that, unless anybody has additional thoughts. Nope. Okay. When including individuals from different backgrounds, from underrepresented backgrounds in your work. Sorry, I skipped over that because diverse that's a trigger for me. They're diverse individuals. There's no such thing because diversity is everybody. It's a group word. It's not a synonym for Black or people of color. Do you feel pressure to get it right or ensure you do those individuals' identities justice? If so, how do you handle this pressure and prevent it from hindering your work? I think it's an interesting question.
I don't know. I've never really, I mean, it's a good question. It's never really popped into my head in quite that way, because, you know, I feel that we are in the business of like telling stories and hearing stories. I mean, that's what we do for a living, but it's also what we do in our everyday work. I mean, that's why what we do is often so fun. I mean, not all of it is fun, but we're always having conversations. And so, and what we love about what we do is that we're always having conversations with people who have different experiences than us, and we're sharing those stories. And so I've never really found that to be a hindrance. Obviously, you have to be a good listener, you have to be sensitive and all of those things. But again, yeah, I mean, I just think that's a big fat plus.
Yeah. I personally, I mean, I think about it quite often. I want to make sure that when you see a character, people aren't looking at it feeling like it's too stereotypical, or just feels like it's too dimensional, or what. Like, I feel like, having seen that a lot, I try to protect characters from it. And one of the things that I do is, with characters, I try to make them as specific as possible. And I try to make sure that I'm not trying to represent a whole monolith with this one character. I'm trying to represent this character and how they feel and how they act and how they react to the things that are happening in the story. So I just feel like it's too much pressure to put on one character a whole culture. So that's the way I kind of like work it through. Like, I'm just trying to make sure that they're representing themselves in a strong way, in a way that feels right for the story, and that they're a part of it in meaningful ways. That's kind of like, but I always do think about it, because I always feel like if you only have one character and they happen to fill a stereotype, then people are gonna look at that and be like, oh, you just created a stereotype, you just put a stereotype and just threw that character in there. And I always feel like I got to make sure that that doesn't happen with characters that I'm putting on TV, because representation is, like the report very clearly says, it's important, because people are looking at it and they're getting a lot from what they're seeing.
Yeah, 100%. I think I answered it, and maybe I misread the question. I think I answered it more about when you're working with folks that are coming from different communities, and, you know, feeling that pressure to make sure that you get it right. But you know, I think it's great that you gave that answer, Anthony, because, you know, in terms of the characters, I think that's obviously equally as important.
Yeah.
And I do think, just building off of what Anthony was saying, like specificity, and, you know, the more representation we get, the less falls on the shoulders of individual characters to have to represent everything, right? Like, I'm like so happy that I'm seeing like queer villains again, and like queer people like not dying, but like but characters, the full totality of experience happening to queer people. And that's because it's not just happening to one character in a story. There are multiple queer characters in a story. So I do think that the more inclusion you kind of bring into a project, the better it is, the more storytelling opportunities you have. It's not so much a barrier as I think it can give you a lot of exciting new paths, personally.
Okay. In in being seen, we talk about to ensure something is authentic, you have to do the work. And doing the work is different for every project and every creator. I was intrigued when Clement Virgo did a panel about his latest film, Brothers, where he said even though he's Jamaican Canadian and it was a Jamaican Canadian story, he still had to do the work to ensure it was authentic, because he's not a Jamaican woman who came here with 2 sons to raise. So can we talk a little bit about what you think are some of the key elements about doing the work? Is that too open-ended?
It's such a huge question, isn't it, in some ways, because it's everything that you've really sort of talked about when your presentation, isn't it? And I think it's, you know, it's a thing that we have to continue to work to, you know, at least for me, speaking for myself, always keep up here and continue to work towards. And it's not always easy, but being aware that you have to always try and do better, you know, is always uppermost, at least for me. But that's a huge question. I think that I don't know how to answer that in sort of 1 or 2 sentences.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's doing the work is really being aware of this, of telling authentic stories, and working towards authenticity on every level of the process of getting something made, right? So that's like from idea generation through to like working with every single department, working with the broadcaster, working with the producers, like, and it requires continual conversation, continual checking of selves, continual awareness of like, if you're confronting a systemic barrier, what are our options? What can we do? I think, I mean, I think it is, that's why it's such a big answer, because it's like, it's everything. Like we have to think about every aspect of the industry in order to get this right, because so much of the discrimination we experience is built into the very structures we use to tell stories, right? So yeah, I do think it requires thought and conversation on every level of the industry.
I think it requires continuing. One of the questions I think you had asked earlier in earlier conversations, Kelly, was whether panels and focus groups like this were, important for us to participate in. And I think in terms of doing the work, part of that is being able to continue, like having Kelly Lynn and her team continue to do these, and to do these to as many different constituent groups as they can, because we know that doing the work is a big job, but we can't do it only by ourselves. There's a whole bunch of other groups out there that need to have that communicated to them and work, like we have to work united. And so it's not just about somebody from an underrepresented group doing the work. It's a much more holistic thing. So these discussions have to continue. It's an opportunity that we have. I mean, my career, I'm going to say I've got a couple of years on all of you young panelists here. And I'll tell you that in the last, couple of years is the first time in my 30-some year career that anybody ever asked me whether I cared about what I saw on the screen, whether I cared whether I saw myself represented in the screen. That was never part of my experience, and I'm guessing many of your experiences. And so to have these conversations, not just amongst ourselves, but to as wide an audience as we can, I think that's how we do the work, because we have to do it hand in hand.
I do think the key is recognizing that this extra work that we're doing is labor. And I think the most helpful thing we can have is the content decision makers and networks and producers and white allies. We need the support to be able to do this work. So for example, how do we make our stories more authentic? For our series, it's set in Alberta, and there's a funny thing about Alberta. White people love Chinese food, and a lot of Indigenous folks, they start Chinese restaurants to make businesses and make them happen and just kind of like own small restaurants, Chinese restaurants in Alberta. And so in order to do to have that in our story, we hired an Indigenous story editor, JJ Leepin, Abdul Malik, who's a story editor on the series, and myself. We made that point to do our research, do our extra kind of like put out feelers out for Indigenous story editor who could bring in their experience and do it right. Similarly, when you're directing on set, it's kind of how do you, you pour out, the script is precious and we want to stick as close to it as possible. But then when you're with the actors on set, maybe they have personal experiences to make sure that the characters aren't so stereotypical, because from the actor's perspective, it's like, oh, I've been going for X role so many years, and I'd really like it if we change this, or maybe if their expression wasn't so hard on this, or maybe a little softer here. And all of that is great, but it does take more time and maybe a little more to factor that into the prep time and the budget. So kind of making it so that that's the rule and not the exception going forward is the best, I think.
And the only thing I have to add to all the great answers here is that we need to, I think, get to a place where it's okay not knowing. You can admit you don't know something. You can admit that you need help. You don't need to have all the answers. Like the whole point is that you realize, oh, you know what, I'm missing something here. Where do I find it? And that's what this is what it's all about, right? Just finding the answers you require to make sure that the thing you're putting out in the world feels right and feels authentic.
I think that's sort of a summation thing. Any last words? We've got time for last words of wisdom or advice.
I just wanted to say quickly, like, thank you to the BSO for putting together this report, because I feel like key to all of these things is statistics and voices, things that we can gesture to in the industry to be like, look, there is real information here that proves our point, right? And so I do think reports like these, studies like these are integral to making sure that we can affect real change. So yeah, thank you for this study.
I'll just add that what I really loved about the study is it is one of those documents where, as you read through it, like your head is nodding the whole time, like you just feel like it's going to fall off the next, like yes. So that was wonderful, and the wonderful feedback that you got from individuals that really sort of gave it, like breathed such life into it, was really fantastic. And I guess the only other piece of advice that I would maybe throw out there is, we are in the business of telling stories and pitching, and when you're pitching stories, remember always that you're pitching yourself. Like, people want to work with people that they like, that they connect with, and even if they're not from your same community, believe that the stories that you have to tell are relevant, are important, are universal enough that they could reach a broader audience. I mean, this is the time, we're in that time, so fly. This is the time to fly.
Anyone else?
I guess the one thing I would say is, like, I feel like a lot of times creators of color feel like they're alone, feel like they're imposters. You're not alone. We're all here. We've all gone through it. We're all doing the same. Like, it's just keep on, and don't just know that you're not alone. I think that's a big thing to realize, and just reach out.
A big thing I learned from actually some of the esteemed panelists here is like learning how to take up space. And I think that's a big thing for being creatives. And I'm grateful for panels like this and events at BIPOC TV and Film and at Real World too, because it's tough to, especially when you don't see yourself just in the industry or see yourself doing that kind of work. It's tough to imagine, like, oh, my story is strong enough, like it's good enough, like I'm created up. You are, like, totally take up that space, I think, and I greatly encourage, like, finding community, yeah, as Anthony said too, you're not alone. Feel free to reach out, and yeah, all kind of like a United Colors of Benetton kind of family.
Well, thank you, everybody. I just want to say to the audience, the being-seen.ca, that's where you can find the report and the directives. And it's a start of a conversation. It's not the end. So we also want to get feedback from how are you using it? Is it helping? Are there things you'd like to know more about? We're going to be doing more of this, and as thank you, Hoda, for saying that all these panels are helpful, because we're just going to keep doing them, because we've learned from the imaginative protocols and pathways people that you have to keep sharing the message, different audiences, different formats, and then finally it trickles down and people start to get it. So we're going to keep doing it, but we'd also like to hear from people about how it's working for them and how it's helping, and where we might need to work on it more. But it's 3 o'clock now, so I think that's it.
Thank you. Yeah, an hour just scratches the surface. But a huge thank you to Kelly, Lynn, Anthony, Christopher, Hoda, and JP for joining us and for sharing your experience. Such a great conversation. And to echo everybody, go read the reports if you haven't already. We shared the link in the chat. And a huge thank you as well to our partners at Telefilm Canada for presenting this session.